When I saw a guy wearing a New Year's hat firing the person who wrote all the code, I immediately thought of my mom. She also works in an office. This video isn't just content for views, it's a story that many people could relate to. Everything you hear is based on real experiences. The company names and names are fictional. Don't repeat other people's mistakes.
I knew things were going sideways the moment I walked into the server room and saw a junior dev trying to manually kill a live process, with a tutorial open on his second screen titled, "How to Revert a Production Rollback." My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I just stood there, arms crossed, watching him like a mom who just found her kid trying to microwave tinfoil. He looked up, stammered something about Denny's new instructions, and I realized this wasn't a fluke. This was coordinated chaos. Let me back up. For 6 years, I ran the spine of ArgentSoft's logistics operations, not the stuff that shows up in glossy investor decks or pitch meetings with dumb metaphors like AI-enhanced synergy. No, I handled the guts. The message queues that kept warehouse inventories synced across 6 states. The failover triggers when a cold chain sensor in Missouri dipped below spec. The audit logs that met FDA retention policy to the bite. While execs played buzzword bingo, I kept the lights on with a system that just worked. And no one noticed until they did. People called me the backbone. Hell, the warehouse guys used to joke I had a direct neural uplink to the servers. But being dependable doesn't mean being respected. Not in tech. Especially not when you're a 42-year-old woman who prefers bash scripts over brainstorm sessions. Anyway, that new CTO, Denny Trask. Just 28, fresh off a funding round where his startup was acquired more for buzz than backend. First thing he did, called my system prehistoric, said we needed velocity, whatever the hell that meant outside of physics. He strutted into meetings with his gelled hair and startup hoodie like he was about to disrupt gravity. And when the board lapped it up, I knew what was coming. They wanted new, sleek, appified. Never mind that I'd built a resilient infrastructure with 99.99% uptime and 0 data loss events across 7 fiscal years. That didn't show well on a pie chart. I wasn't flashy. I was just good. And apparently, that made me a liability. Before we go further, if you're listening to this and you've ever been quietly holding an entire company together while getting dismissed as outdated, hit the like button. And for the love of legacy systems, subscribe. 97% of folks don't. And this story, oh, it's just getting started. Your support keeps it alive. Now, here's where it started to curdle. At first, they did what all tech bros do when they're out of their depth. They talked. Denny started throwing around terms like bloatware, dead weight, refactor pathways. Half the team didn't know what he meant, and the other half were too afraid to say he was talking nonsense. He started restructuring code bases he hadn't even read. He called stand-ups sinks and documented nothing. He wanted to rip out everything and replace it with cloud-native microservices. Sounds nice, right? Until you realize that for ArgentSoft, cloud native meant untested, unsecured, and undocumented. I stayed quiet, but I started backing things up in a different place. A place Denny couldn't see. The worst moment came during a Tuesday sync when he smirked at me across the table and said, "Your code base is charming, Michelle, like a rotary phone." Everyone chuckled, even the junior I mentored last year. I didn't flinch, just tilted my head and replied, "Rotary phones never dropped calls." That shut the room up, but not for long, because 3 days later, I lost admin access. No warning, no email, just a blinking red error when I tried to deploy a patch. The platform I'd built, the structure I'd guarded like a digital sentry for 6 years, had locked me out, like I was some intern who clicked the wrong Jenkins job. But here's what Denny didn't know. See, ArgentSoft never bought the entire system. They licensed it. Through my LLC, Northbridge Logic. That middleware he just cut himself off from, that wasn't owned by the company. It was licensed annually. Clause 7, page 19. Signed by the founder himself. Non-transferable, non-replicable, revocable upon termination of licensee. I didn't shout. Didn't stomp down to legal. I just printed one thing. A slim folder, labeled in permanent ink, Clause 7. And I waited, because you don't warn someone standing on a trap door. You let them dance a little longer. March opened with a bang, a cheerful Slack announcement from Denny about streamlining infrastructure for velocity and scalability. That corporate gobbledygook meant one thing. He was gutting my architecture. Overnight, words like bloatware and technical debt started infecting the code-based conversations. Suddenly, my meticulously layered service queues and latency buffers were just redundant artifacts to him. Never mind they were the reason our routing platform didn't implode during last year's December freight surge. Never mind they'd passed every compliance audit cold. He didn't understand the system, and instead of learning it, he blamed it. My team started coming to me in whispers. Pull requests weren't getting merged. Jira tickets I'd greenlit were quietly marked obsolete. One back-end engineer, smart kid named Ruben, slid into my DMs one night and just typed, "Michelle, something's off." He archived the master repo and spun up a new one on their cloud bucket. None of your hooks made it over. None. I thanked him, logged off, and sat there a moment, letting the weight of it land. But I wasn't shocked. That's the thing about betrayal in tech. It rarely shows up all at once. It comes in commits and quiet access changes. In reorg decks you're not copied on. In stand-ups that start 5 minutes earlier until you stop showing up altogether. Then came the lockout. I tried to push a hot fix for an overnight error. Clicked into the core deployment interface. Access denied. No email. No Slack. Not even a passive-aggressive, "we've moved in a new direction." Just a silent lockout on the very system I'd nurtured through 6 product launches, 2 major overhauls, and 1 hellish SOC2 Type 2 audit. And I'll tell you the truth, I didn't panic. I didn't even blink. Because the moment I saw that denial prompt, I knew what Denny had just done. He didn't just cut me off, he cut the company off. That middleware environment, every log sanitization layer, every load balancing daemon, every interface bridge between vendors wasn't owned by ArgentSoft. It was licensed. Through my own company, Northbridge Logic, I structured the deal when I rebuilt the architecture in 2019. Why? Because I've been in this game long enough to know you don't hand over your keys to people who'll never understand the engine. And the best part? The license agreement wasn't tucked away in some cobwebbed folder. Clause 7, Page 19, plain English, bold print. Ownership of all non-core services, interface bridges, and middleware routing infrastructure remains the intellectual and operational property of Northbridge Logic, LLC. Use license is granted to ArgentSoft Inc. for internal operational use only. License is non-transferable, and revocation rights are retained in the event of employment termination or operational breach. Signed by the founder and chairman, Paul Forrester. Dated, witnessed, filed. They didn't own the heart of their system. They leased it. And Denny, bless his overconfident soul, had just pulled the plug on his own oxygen line. I didn't respond to the access removal. I just spent the evening updating my own backups and letting legal stew in blissful ignorance. They didn't even realize a countdown had begun. But you want to know the kicker? That Friday, Denny strutted into the cafeteria, held up his phone, and said loud enough for 3 tables to hear, "Legacy's out. Agile's in. Welcome to the future." And I almost laughed. Because in about 4 business days, Legacy was going to be the only thing keeping their compliance logs from falling apart at the seams. Denny thought he was cleaning house. What he was really doing was flipping the breaker on the only thing holding the damn building together. He came in like he was walking onto a TED Talk stage, button down open just enough to show the absence of chest hair, holding that smug little printout like it was the Magna Carta. "Michelle," he said, like we were old friends, "we've reviewed your conduct. This Slack conversation shows you've been resistant to innovation, toxic to team culture, so..." He flung the paper across my desk with a flick of the wrist that said he'd practiced that move in a mirror. "You're done here." That was the moment I realized how little he understood what he'd walked into. You don't fire a systems architect like she's a barista who put oat milk in your latte. You do it with lawyers, with documents. You don't just come in swinging with buzzwords and printed chat logs. I didn't respond. Not right away. I just opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a slim manila folder, labeled in bold Sharpie, Clause 7. He snorted. "What is this? A last-ditch resume?" I handed it to him without a word. Watched him sit. Watched the grin fade like it had been wiped from his face with a damp rag. Page 1. Introductory language. Page 2. Definitions of scope, jurisdiction, usage rights. Then it hit. Page 3, paragraph 4, clause 7. His lips moved as he read aloud, too low to make out the words, but I saw the shape of one in particular. Revocable. He flipped back, suddenly panicked, eyes scanning for the signature line, and there it was, crisp and clean, right above the date, November 6th, 2019, Paul Forrester's signature, Argent Soft's founder, still chairman of the board, and beneath it, mine. Denny looked up at me like he'd just realized the cockpit door had locked behind him and the engine was on fire. Who approved this? He asked, voice soft now. The smirk was gone, the start-up swagger leaking out of him like a deflated yoga ball. I tilted my head toward the corner where my plaque sat. Brass. Engraved. Paul Forrester, founder and chairman, I said, like I was reading him a bedtime story with a sharp edge. He stood slowly, folded the folder, but his hands were shaking and he was holding it upside down. You didn't think we'd read this, I said, still calm. That was your first mistake. Your second was assuming legacy meant powerless. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. Just a dry click in his throat like someone trying to swallow a thumbtack. Effective immediately, he finally managed. You're terminated. I nodded. Then, so is your access to the middleware. He blinked. That's not your call. It is, I said, standing, because you just severed the license tether, which makes your continued use of my system, your entire logistics infrastructure, Denny, legally unauthorized. He blinked again, twice, then turned and left without another word, the folder still in his hand, upside down. By the time he hit the hallway, I heard his pace quicken. Not a walk, not a jog, a controlled sprint. I imagine he went straight to legal. I didn't chase him. Instead, I sat back down, pulled out my notebook, wrote 3 words at the top of the page, Clause 7 activated. Then I opened a fresh document on my laptop. Subject line, Revocation Notice, License IDNL 44821. It was time to let the system speak for itself. By 4:36 p.m., I got the ping. Internal message from legal, short and panicked. Hi, Michelle. Do you have 10 minutes to talk? I didn't reply. I closed the tab, leaned back, and took a slow sip of the gas station coffee I'd been nursing since lunch. Let them sweat. They weren't asking out of courtesy. They were trying to stop a bleed they didn't know they'd cause with a butter knife. 45 minutes later, I heard it. The muffled thunder of raised voices echoing down the glass corridor. My office was 3 doors from legal, 5 from risk. Denny's voice carried first, shrill and tight. No one told me we didn't own it. Then someone from legal, trying to play calm. The contract's been in place since before your hire. Denny again, louder this time. Why wasn't it flagged in onboarding? I smiled without meaning to. The kind of smile you give when someone finally steps on the rake you warned them about, twice. Here's what was happening behind those walls. They just discovered the audit logs. The same logs I designed to be immutable. Every system update, patch, hook, and heartbeat ping had my digital fingerprint on it. Michelle A. Harmon, Northbridge Logic, LLC, timestamped, version controlled with location metadata. Denny's migration hadn't just failed to replace the core system. It had violated the license by pulling snippets of middleware logic into their new deployment bucket. That's what kicked the real nightmare into gear, because Clause 7 doesn't just revoke access upon termination. It enforces liquidated damages for unauthorized derivative use. Amount listed, $2,000 non-negotiable, not symbolic. Enforceable under the licensing terms they'd agreed to 4 years ago and auto-renewed every June without so much as blinking. I knew the clause by heart. I'd written it myself. And that was the moment it became real to them. Not the shouting. Not the realization that Denny had fired the architect of their critical infrastructure without a contingency plan. No. The real panic started when they understood this wasn't theoretical. They couldn't just roll it back. They couldn't rehire me and sweep it under the rug. The revocation was already in motion. The license tether, gone. The environment, legally dead. And if they touched a single module in production after that revocation timestamp, That $2 invoice would be in their inbox by Monday morning, along with a registered letter to their legal department outlining every breach. It was all there. Every kill switch, every clause, every breadcrumb they'd missed because they were too busy chasing innovation to read the damn paperwork. And Denny? Poor Denny. He had no idea he'd just wandered into a field laced with landmines, wearing clown shoes, dancing to the beat of his own arrogance. They thought they were building something new, but really, they were just digging a hole. And now they were screaming at the bottom of it, realizing I still had the only ladder. They came at it like surgeons with a butter knife, scalpel in one hand, Google search in the other. Denny called an emergency meeting first thing Wednesday morning. No calendar invite, just a blanket. Urgent. Infra recovery strategy blast that hit everyone from junior engineers to the poor PM who still thought middleware referred to snack options between meetings. The goal was simple: rebuild the core without me, recreate the whole system from scratch in under 72 hours. Because of course, that's something you can totally do with zero documentation, no access to production logs, and an active legal noose tightening by the hour. I heard from Ruben, again, quietly. They're trying to write replacements for your escalation routines, he said, but they can't find where they live. Of course they couldn't, because those weren't standalone files. They were woven into the heartbeat of the system, triggered by environment thresholds, not manual calls. Every queue manager, every escalation routine, every log cleaning daemon, they weren't surface level scripts. They were lattice work. Interdependencies built over 6 years, one operational lesson at a time. A failed vendor ping at 2 a.m.? That kicked off a suppressor that paused downstream alerts so the system didn't flood the dashboard. A missed handshake with the cold chain provider? That triggered a redirect and timestamp flag to preserve data compliance. It wasn't elegant, but it was resilient. And it worked. They had no idea where to start. Denny, of course, refused to admit defeat. Let's start clean, he told his engineers. We'll rebuild modularly, fresh code, no legacy bloat. They tried. Day one, they stood up a test environment with basic routing logic. Looked good on the surface, until the logs filled up with 1,000 unresolved errors in 6 hours. The load balancer didn't recognize the switchboard. The error handler couldn't distinguish between client pings and server requests. None of the scaling routines engaged. Day 2, it bricked completely. Backend collapsed under load testing. The new database instance spun into an infinite loop trying to reconcile a 2-year-old vendor sync request that never cleared because my system had been flagging and suppressing it every 72 hours to avoid a recursive timeout. They didn't know that, because no one ever asked how it worked. They just assumed it was old, outdated, replaceable. Legal by then had begun to panic in more polite terms. They asked for documentation proving corporate authorship of the components. DevOps replied with a one-line message copied to the legal channel. All critical components are proprietary under license. No internal replication exists. Translation: they didn't own a single line of the logic that kept their backbone alive, and every attempt to reverse engineer it, breach, Clause 7b, unauthorized derivative use, $2 million, tick, tick, tick. I wasn't watching them scramble with glee. I wasn't even watching. I was hiking. Took Thursday off, drove 3 hours upstate, and walked trails I hadn't seen in years. Let my phone stay dead in the glove box. By the time I came back down, they'd already burned 2 full days trying to build a raft with no nails, no wood, and no map of the river. They didn't just fire the architect. They evicted themselves from the only house they had, boarded the windows from the outside, and then called legal asking why there was no oxygen left inside. And that's when I knew. They weren't trying to win anymore. They were trying to survive. By Thursday morning, the legal office at Argentsoft finally stopped pretending the folder I handed Denny was just a bluff. I imagine it happened sometime between their second all-nighter and the moment their junior associate realized the copy of the contract they'd been referencing wasn't even the latest version. See, I'd renewed it quietly. Each year, same terms, same clauses, but with one subtle tweak, a clarified trigger term. Clause 7b, paragraph 3. In the event of license revocation due to employment termination, systems utilizing Northbridge logic infrastructure shall be considered non-compliant after 72 hours. non-compliant. Not degraded, not unsupported, non-compliant. In other words, legally inoperable. From a vendor risk standpoint, from an insurance standpoint, from a federal auditing standpoint. The moment that 3-day window expired, Argentsoft's entire logistics platform would become a blinking red liability on every regulatory document they'd signed in the last 18 months. But the clause didn't stop there. The very next paragraph read, attempted replication, partial decompilation, or reverse engineering of licensed infrastructure shall trigger immediate invoice enforcement of liquidated damages, not less than $2 million USD, $2,000, and may be escalated to legal proceedings without additional notice. The test environment they tried to build from scratch, strike one. The partial vendor interface they tried to reconstruct using snippets from deprecated code, strike two. The fact that they continued running the production environment after firing me, that wasn't strike three. That was the detonation switch. The 67 words in that clause had more weight than every meeting Denny had ever led combined. And he had no idea. Because for all his bravado, for all his agile sprints and LinkedIn buzzwords about legacy burnout, he never once asked how the system was licensed, never read the contract, never understood that I'd been holding the leash the whole time. He just assumed that age equaled obsolescence. The irony? That junk code he mocked was the very reason their biggest client, a federal logistics integrator tied to multiple DoD transport contracts, had stayed loyal through every platform migration. The same client who demanded quarterly system compliance reports signed by someone with credentials like mine. The same client who, if they detected 1 minute of non-compliance, could pull a 7-figure annual contract without recourse. That's what they risked. For ego. Denny got called back into the war room late Thursday. I wasn't there, obviously, but Ruben kept me informed. He messaged one line. CEO just asked who signed the contract. Legal said your name. Denny stopped talking. I pictured it. The pale realization dawning across his face. That the problem wasn't me being gone. The problem was me being the only one who'd ever been holding it together in the first place. And now? The timer was ticking. 72 hours. They'd already burned 48. The house wasn't just on fire. It was built from matchsticks. And Denny? He was standing there holding the gas can, asking legal why the flames were getting higher. Friday at 9:07 a.m., my attorney sent the email. Subject line. Formal revocation. License ID NL 444821. Notice of breach and invoice. Attached. A neatly formatted PDF watermarked in blue with the Northbridge Logic logo titled Invoice for Unauthorized Derivative Use and Continued Operation Post-Revocation. Amount due $2,000. Due within 15 business days. Delivery emailed. BCC'd to the board. Registered hard copy sent to legal's direct line at headquarters. Timestamped and filed with a read receipt. I didn't send it with drama. No flaming subject lines, no all-caps threats. Just pure procedural precision. The kind that makes lawyers sweat because it's so calm, so dry, so utterly unshakable. Within 23 minutes, I got my first reply. Forwarded by the chairman, Paul Forrester. Just one line. Why wasn't this flagged in Denny's transition memo? That one hit like a knife to the ribs. 10 minutes later, another came in. This one from the audit chair. Did legal sign off on the termination package? Shortly after that, silence. Long, cold silence, the kind that makes the air feel thicker, the kind that smells like people quietly shredding meeting minutes and scrubbing Slack threads. Not a word from Denny, not a ping from HR, both mysteriously absent from the chain, as if they'd been vaporized the moment things went legal. And that's when I knew the real game had begun. They weren't trying to solve the problem anymore. They were trying to distance themselves from it. Denny had become a contagion, a resume time bomb with unauthorized breach of contract and $2 liability pulsing beneath the surface like a bad ticker. And me? I was no longer an ex-employee. I was a vendor with leverage because I didn't just hit send. I hit them with a line at the bottom of the invoice, calm as can be. Northbridge is open to license renewal discussions at adjusted terms. No threats, no ultimatums, just a door. A door that costs more to leave closed than to walk through. And let's be clear, I didn't want to go back. Not in the way they imagined, but I knew they couldn't unwind what I'd built. not without burning millions and risking federal audits. They needed access. They needed continuity. They needed someone to explain to investors why Argentsoft's logistics system hadn't collapsed when the entire country was watching Q1 fulfillment numbers. And there I was, standing in the ashes of their own arrogance, offering them a lifeline, not out of mercy, out of terms, updated ones. Denny never responded, but that night, Ruben texted me a screenshot of a private Slack message between two VPs. Did we seriously fire the one person who knew how to breathe underwater, then wonder why the ship's flooding? I didn't reply. Didn't need to, because by Monday morning, the question wouldn't be whether I was coming back. It would be how fast they could afford to put me on a retainer. The call came at 8:14 a.m., Monday. Not a calendar invite, not a message from legal. A direct ring, my personal number, one I hadn't used in 3 years. Caller ID, unknown. I let it go to voicemail, twice. On the third attempt, I answered. Calm, neutral. Michelle, the voice said. Male, polished, trying to sound conversational. This is Mark Hadley, CEO at Argentsoft, wondering if we could discuss a potential reinstatement. He said the word like it was covered in barbed wire. I didn't respond right away. Just let the silence stretch long enough for the discomfort to land. Then, I don't think that would align with Clause 7's continuity terms. He exhaled, sharp and frustrated but practiced, like someone used to getting his way with charm and realizing it was expired currency. I understand. I do, he said. Could we at least talk about a renewable license? Same infrastructure, just different framework. You wouldn't have to rejoin formally. Just help us stabilize. There it was, the white flag, wrapped in legalese and corporate humility. I considered dragging it out. Asking if Denny would be delivering the check in person, asking if legal had figured out how to read contracts yet. But I didn't, because this wasn't about ego, it was about control. So I laid out the terms. Crisp, professional, zero wiggle room. You'll retain access to all legacy infrastructure under a renewable quarterly consulting agreement. Northbridge Logic maintains ownership of the middleware and architecture and reserves the right to revoke access at will. Rates will be double my prior compensation. All access is read-only unless expressly upgraded via contract addendum. Terms are non-negotiable. Silence on the other end, a long one. I pictured him in his glass-walled office, staring at a legal pad full of failed strategies. Finally, he said, "We can accept that." I nodded. Good. And Denny? He trailed off. I waited. He's been reassigned. Internal product vertical. No system-level authority. Of course he had. They didn't fire him. Too messy. But they clipped his wings, probably stuffed him into a corner product with no back-end dependency, no client touchpoints, and no real risk of breaking in something expensive. A padded playpen for failed disruptors. Please have legal forward the updated terms to Northbridge's counsel by noon, I said. We'll countersign after review. Thank you, Michelle, he said quietly. I didn't thank him back. This wasn't a favor. It was a correction. They had confused silence for passivity, misread documentation for obsolescence, treated the foundation like clutter, and were surprised when the building cracked under its own weight. Now they knew. I wasn't coming back to fix their mess. I was arriving, on retainer, to make sure it didn't get worse. And this time, every hour I gave them would be billed, tracked, and backed by a license agreement they'd never forget to read again. 2 weeks later, I walked into their Manhattan boardroom like a ghost they thought they'd buried. No escort, no assistant. Just me, a leather folder under my arm, and a look on my face that said, I don't need to be here, but you do. The air was thinner than I remembered. Not from altitude, but consequence. The CTO chair was empty. No nameplate, no jacket slung over the back. Just an untouched glass of water sweating into a coaster. Denny wasn't part of this conversation, they'd said. He was exploring new internal initiatives. I imagined him on floor 9, where bad projects go to die and people say things like, we're still in the ideation phase until someone forgets they exist. Legal sat across from me. 2 associates and a partner, armed with printed contracts, highlighters, and the uneasy twitch of people who'd recently learned how expensive oops can be. I said nothing. Just opened the folder, pulled out the final copy of the consulting agreement, and placed it flat on the table. The cover read, Northbridge Logic, Licensed Infrastructure Operations Renewal, Q1 2026. The document was 63 pages long, and they initialed every damn one of them, quietly, without edits, without pushback. The new terms were baked in: double my former rate, limited access, no derivative rights, read only by default unless escalated through written request, and 2 signatures, mine and theirs. They didn't blink. They just signed. Because this wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was a settlement with a smile. On the final page, the signature line stared up at me. I clicked my pen open, wrote my name slow and steady. Then, just above the date, I wrote one more line by hand. Clean, bold, unmistakable. No future system may integrate Northbridge logic architecture without written renewal. The partner from legal looked up, startled. Eyes darted to the CEO. Mark didn't hesitate, just nodded once. Understood. The ink dried in seconds. The deal, much faster. The $2 million had already cleared escrow that morning. The invoice was marked paid in full. And somewhere deep inside their DevOps dashboard, a new message lit up in green beneath the legacy system login. System active. License to operate. Owner. Northbridge Logic. That was it. No press release, no welcome back, Michelle. Just lines of code and contract. And a quiet, undeniable reminder. They thought they'd removed me. What they really did was restart the meter. Because the system stayed. I stayed. And now they paid.